The autumn air was sharper than usual as I wound the leash around my gloved hand, feeling the cold bite through to my skin. The streetlights cast halos of weak yellow light, pooling onto the cracked pavement in uneven circles. My dog, a stocky black Labrador named Murphy, trotted ahead of me, his tail a cheerful metronome against the oppressive silence of the neighborhood. He loved these nightly walks, bounding with an energy that reminded me of brighter days. But tonight, there was something off. The air carried a different weight, pressing against my lungs with every breath. As we passed the boarded-up house on the corner, the one that had been empty since the owner vanished 2 years ago, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder. The wind whispered through the skeletal branches of trees, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a shadow flit across one of the broken windows. Just nerves, I told myself. Murphy suddenly stopped in his tracks, nose twitching. His body went stiff. He had a way of sensing things before I ever could, and my pulse quickened at his change in demeanor. He started pulling me toward the small wooded park at the edge of the neighborhood, a patch of land that used to be a pleasant cut-through to the main road before the city let it fall into neglect. Now it was overgrown, thorny brambles spilling onto the cracked walking path. Even in daylight, few people ventured into the woods anymore. "Come on, Murph. Not tonight," I muttered, trying to steer him away. He wouldn't budge. He strained against the leash, barking sharply once, then digging his paws into the soft earth. His whine was urgent. I sighed, giving in, and followed him. Each step felt heavy, the night around me growing more oppressive with every movement closer to the tangled trees. The leaves crackled underfoot, brittle and dry. The smell of damp earth and something else metallic, sharp, hit my nose. Murphy's barking turned into a low growl as he led me deeper into the shadows. My flashlight, weak and flickering, barely pierced the darkness. I was about to tug him back, call it quits, when he stopped dead, nose buried in a pile of leaves. "Murphy, what did you find?" I asked, forcing a laugh that came out more brittle than I intended. I tugged at the leash, but he refused to move, pawing frantically at the ground. My stomach clenched as the beam of my flashlight fell on something pale jutting from the leaves. At first, my mind refused to process it. It could have been a thick tree root, bleached by age, but as I stepped closer, the details crystallized with horrifying clarity. The thing in the dirt was a human foot, severed cleanly above the ankle, skin grayish and flecked with grime. It lay there, disturbingly out of place, as if dropped from the sky. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back, my hand reflexively yanking Murphy away. He barked again, more frantic now, his hackles raised. I turned, searching the darkness for any sign of movement. The woods were deathly quiet, too quiet. It was as if the night itself had frozen in place, waiting. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers trembling so badly that I nearly dropped it. Just as I managed to unlock the screen, a rustling noise erupted from somewhere deep in the trees. It was fast, jagged, like something dragging itself over dry leaves and twigs. "Hello," my voice cracked. The rustling stopped, and for a terrible moment, I wished I had kept my mouth shut. The silence stretched on, tense and expectant. I could hear Murphy's heavy breathing and the wild thud of my own heartbeat. Then from the shadows came a low, guttural laugh, inhuman and wet, as though it struggled through a mouthful of fluid. I backed away slowly, dragging Murphy with me, my flashlight beam swinging wildly. "We have to go," I whispered, as much to myself as to him. My legs felt like lead, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't risk turning my back on whatever hid in the darkness. Step by agonizing step, we moved toward the path's edge. I couldn't see the foot anymore. The leaves had shifted in the wind, swallowing it back into their brittle embrace. I wished I'd never seen it. We reached the street, and the oppressive weight seemed to lift, just slightly. I exhaled shakily, my breath fogging in the cold air. Whatever was in those woods had stayed behind for now. I glanced back, half expecting to see a figure standing at the tree line, but there was nothing. Just darkness and the skeletal branches swaying in the wind. Once home, I bolted the door behind me and double-checked every lock. Murphy paced restlessly, whining at the window. I turned on every light in the house, the shadows retreating to the corners but never fully disappearing. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That I found a severed foot and heard something? They'd think I was crazy, and maybe I was. I needed sleep, though I doubted it would come easily. I was right. Hours passed, and each creak of the house made me jump. Around 3 a.m., just as exhaustion finally started to drag me under, Murphy began to growl. His gaze was fixed on the window facing the street. I followed his eyes and felt the blood drain from my face. Someone was standing there, barely visible at the edge of the pool of light cast by the nearest street lamp. They were perfectly still, head tilted as if listening. For a moment I thought I recognized the figure. It looked almost like Mr. Henley, the man who used to live in the boarded-up house on the corner. But that was impossible. He'd been missing for years. I moved to the window, heart hammering, and the figure stepped back, melting into the shadows. I couldn't be sure anymore. Was it even human? The wind howled, rattling the panes, and Murphy barked again. I turned away, pulling the curtains shut, but I knew that tonight's walk had changed everything. The woods had given me a secret, and something or someone wanted it back. It wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. Sleep remained a foreign concept that night, slipping further from reach each time Murphy let out a low growl or the house settled with a groan. My mind replayed the image of that severed foot beneath the leaves and the shadowy figure by the street lamp. Who or what had I seen? Questions spun uselessly, and as dawn's weak light crept into the sky, I finally stumbled to the kitchen, desperate for coffee. I was halfway through my second cup when the pounding on the front door startled me so badly I spilled it. Murphy barked, his fur bristling. I steadied my breathing and forced myself to the door. Peering through the peephole, I saw two figures, police officers. I felt a rush of relief and dread all at once. Maybe someone else had seen what I saw. Maybe they'd found something more in those woods. But as I opened the door, I saw the officers' guarded expressions, their eyes scanning me like I was already a suspect. "Good morning," so the taller one said, his voice too clipped for pleasantries. His badge read Officer Wilkes. "We'd like to ask you a few questions about last night." My stomach dropped. Of course. They stepped inside, and I led them to the living room, where Murphy watched them warily. The other officer, a woman named Torres, flipped open a small notebook. "We received reports of unusual activity around the park last night," she said, her tone careful. A neighbor mentioned hearing barking and other sounds. My mind raced. I was walking my dog. He got spooked by something. Spooked by what? Wilkes pressed, his eyes narrowing. "I don't know," I admitted, too aware of how thin my explanation sounded. "There was something in the woods. We heard rustling. I thought maybe an animal." Wilkes exchanged a glance with Torres. "An animal," he repeated. "Did this animal happen to leave any remains?" My throat went dry. "Remains," I echoed, stalling. The memory of that severed foot surfaced, bringing a wave of nausea. Torres leaned forward. "A jogger found what appears to be a human body part in the woods early this morning, near where you were seen." My pulse pounded. I saw it last night. I was going to call, but it was late." "So you did see it?" Wilkes' voice hardened. "Why didn't you report it immediately?" "It didn't seem safe to linger," I said, and it was the truth. Their skeptical expressions didn't waver. There was something else. I thought I saw a person near my house afterward. Torres' pen stopped moving. "Can you describe them?" "It was dark," I said, my own voice sounding hollow. I couldn't see clearly, but it looked like someone I knew, a man named Henley. He used to live nearby. "Used to?" Wilkes raised an eyebrow. "He disappeared years ago." They shared another look. "We'll need to follow up on that," Torres said, her tone softening just a fraction. "In the meantime, stay reachable." They left without further explanation, and I watched their patrol car disappear down the street. My gut told me they knew more than they were letting on. That sense of being watched, that nightmarish presence in the woods, it wasn't just paranoia. Whatever lay hidden there, it had already started unspooling into something larger. The day crawled by. I kept myself busy cleaning, pacing, checking every lock in the house. By late afternoon, exhaustion dragged at me again. I lay down on the couch, eyes fluttering shut. I wasn't asleep long. Someone was knocking again, but softer this time. When I opened the door, an older woman stood on my porch, her face worn by too many years of worry. I recognized her before she spoke. Mr. Henley's sister, I said, memories of her desperate search for her brother flashing back. She'd papered the neighborhood with missing posters, worn out her shoes walking door to door. She nodded. I heard they found something. Her voice was hoarse. I know it's him. I know it's my brother. I didn't know what to say. I'm sorry, I really don't. Please, she cut in, a tremor running through her words. They never listened. They called him a drunk, a drifter, but he wasn't. He had enemies. She leaned closer, her eyes hollow. They never left. I wanted to shut the door, to tell her it wasn't my problem. But her words clawed at something buried deep in me. Enemies. She nodded, glancing back at the street, as if afraid of being overheard. Before he vanished, he told me things, terrible things. People in the woods, not alive, but not gone either. Her hand trembled as she wiped a tear from her cheek. He said they'd take him. I thought he was losing his mind, but now. Her words felt like an icy wind slicing through me. You think it's related to what's in the woods? She stepped back, her face pale. Be careful. They watched with that. She hurried away, leaving me standing there, my pulse hammering. That night I bolted every lock again and sat in the dark with Murphy at my feet. Every noise outside set my nerves on edge. Around midnight, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside my window. Slow, deliberate. I crept closer, heart pounding. The curtains fluttered slightly, and I peeked through a gap. A man stood in my yard, half hidden by shadows. His face was pale, eyes glassy and unblinking. My blood turned to ice. It was Mr. Henley. Was something wearing his face? He raised one hand, pressing it against the window, and his mouth moved as if whispering words I couldn't hear. The glass fogged where his breath touched it. When I blinked, he was gone, leaving only an empty yard and the memory of his hollow stare. I backed away, my legs shaking. Murphy growled low, his eyes never leaving the window. Whatever was out there, it wasn't done with me. And deep down, I feared that the severed foot was just the beginning, a sign that something darker had finally clawed its way back from the woods. In many ways, it felt like just the beginning of something that had been lying in wait for far too long. I barely slept that night, jumping at every creak of the house and every gust of wind. Morning brought little comfort. The pale light only seemed to sharpen the shadows, making everything feel brittle and false. I'd seen Mr. Henley, or what was left of him, outside my window. That much I was sure of, though the rest of it felt impossible to make sense of. I tried convincing myself it was stress or sleep deprivation, but deep down, I knew better. I needed answers. The first place I went was the library, hoping to find any trace of Mr. Henley's disappearance. The records were sparse, but I did find a few old articles, mostly unremarkable. Henley had been a quiet man with no criminal record. One piece mentioned how he'd become reclusive toward the end, rambling to neighbors about strange people watching him. That lined up with what his sister had said, but it still felt thin. As I skimmed the text, something caught my eye, a brief mention of other disappearances in the area over the past 3 decades. No names, no details, just a suggestion that people sometimes vanished from our neighborhood without a trace. I left with a knot of fear in my gut. If there was a pattern, no one was willing to speak openly about it. Back at home, I tried piecing together what little I knew. That's when the scratching started, faint at first, like a branch scraping the side of the house. Murphy perked up, ears pricked, his eyes fixed on the back door. I stood slowly, every nerve on edge. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, as if something was clawing to be let in. I grabbed a flashlight and edged toward the door, my breath coming in short gasps. I hesitated with my hand on the knob, listening. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a muffled thump. I opened the door, just a crack, the flashlight trembling in my grip, and shined it into the yard. Empty. Only the rustle of wind through the trees. I stepped outside, scanning for any movement. Murphy stayed by my side, teeth bared. A metallic scent hit me sharp, unmistakable. Blood. I shined the light downward and my stomach lurched. There, smeared across the threshold, was a message scrawled in thick, dripping letters: leave. I stumbled back inside, slamming the door shut and throwing the bolt. My hands were shaking, my mind racing. Who would do that? Or what? As if on cue, my phone buzzed, startling me. It was an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Did you see it?" The voice was male, low and rasping. It sounded familiar but wrong, like someone trying too hard to mimic a human tone. "Who is this?" I demanded, though I already knew I wouldn't like the answer. A pause, then a chilling laugh, the same wet, choking sound I'd heard in the woods. "You know me." The line went dead. My mind reeled. This wasn't just a threat. It was a game, and I was already losing. The next few days blurred together, a mix of fear, exhaustion, and paranoia. I avoided the woods, but it didn't matter. Whatever was out there had no intention of letting me escape. Footsteps in the yard at night, shadows passing by the windows, Murphy barking at things I couldn't see. Each new incident ratcheted up the tension, until I felt like I was living with a blade pressed to my throat. One evening, as I was staring blankly at my kitchen table, there was a knock at the door. It was a soft, hesitant tapping, almost like a child. I considered ignoring it, but something compelled me to look. I opened the door to find Henley's sister standing there again, her eyes hollowed out by sleeplessness. "They're not gone," she whispered, her voice raw. "They never left." I let her in, and she paced the room, wringing her hands. Before he disappeared, my brother told me there was a place in the woods where they gathered. He called it the Hollow. Said it was older than anything, older than this town. He tried to show me once, but I couldn't go. I was too afraid. "What's in the Hollow?" I asked, dread coiling in my chest. "Things that wear faces," she said. "Things that trade flesh for shadows. They took him." She grabbed my arm, her grip cold and desperate. "They'll take anyone who gets too close." "Why me?" I asked, though part of me already knew. "Why now?" "Because you found what they left behind," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "You uncovered their secret, and now they're awake." I wanted to tell her she was wrong. I wanted to believe this was just the ramblings of a grieving woman, but the fear in her voice was too real. "How do I stop it?" I asked. "You can't." She let go of my arm and moved to the window, peering out as if expecting to see something lurking in the yard. "But you can hide, you can leave." Before I could respond, Murphy barked a sharp, desperate sound. I turned just in time to see a shadow pass across the hallway. Not a person, not exactly. Its movements were wrong, jerky, almost like a marionette being pulled on strings. It melted into the darkness as quickly as it appeared. Henley's sister whispered, "They're here." We barricaded ourselves in the kitchen, Murphy growling at the door. The scratching started again, this time louder, accompanied by faint whispers that slipped through the cracks in the walls. They were taunting us, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the door gave way. I gripped a kitchen knife, my knuckles white. Whatever was coming for us, I wouldn't go down without a fight. But deep down, I knew this was a battle I couldn't win, not alone. The Hollow had woken, and it wanted to drag us all into its darkness. The scratching grew louder, like claws scraping across the wood. The whispers swelled, overlapping in a twisted chorus that made my ears ache. I gripped the knife tighter, sweat slicking my palms. Henley's sister was pale, eyes fixed on the door, as if she could see through it to whatever was waiting on the other side. Then the noise stopped. The sudden silence was worse. It pressed against me, thick and suffocating, making it hard to breathe. Murphy whined, his tail tucked between his legs, and backed into the far corner. I held my breath, listening. Somewhere in the dark, floorboards creaked, slow and deliberate, as if something heavy was shifting its weight. "They're trying to scare us," Henley's sister whispered. "Don't let them in." I nodded, but the air felt too thick, like I was drowning in it. I could feel them pressing closer, brushing against the edges of the room. I forced myself to take a step forward, to fight back the urge to cower. But when the doorknob began to rattle, my resolve cracked. It wasn't a frantic shake, it was controlled, almost leisurely, as if whatever was on the other side had all the time in the world. The door burst open, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over Murphy. Shadows poured in like a living thing, coiling and writhing, forming shapes that twisted and blurred. For a moment, I thought I saw faces distorted and hollow-eyed, mouths stretched in silent screams. One of the shapes broke away from the rest and stepped into the light. It was Mr. Henley, or something wearing his face. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet being dragged across the floor. His eyes met mine, glassy and empty. "They want you," he said, the words spilling from his lips in a grotesque parody of speech. "They always take what they want." Henley's sister screamed, and the shadows surged. I swung the knife, but it passed through them like mist. Cold tendrils wrapped around my wrists and ankles, pulling me down. The room twisted, darkening at the edges. Murphy barked frantically, lunging at the shapes, but they swatted him away as if he were nothing more than an insect. My vision blurred. I was sinking, the world around me falling away into darkness. Then, as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The shadows retreated, leaving only the faint stench of rot. I gasped for air, collapsing to the floor. Henley's sister knelt beside me, her face pale and drawn. "They've marked you," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You're in their game now." I didn't have the strength to argue. The room felt colder, emptier, as if the shadows had stolen something vital. I forced myself to stand, bracing against the counter. "What do they want?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "They need to drag you into the hollow," she said, "to make you one of them. But it's not just you, it's this place. They're hungry, and they'll keep taking until they're fed." I glanced around, half expecting the shadows to surge back through the door. They didn't. But the weight of her words pressed down on me. If I didn't stop whatever was happening, more people would disappear. More lives would be claimed by whatever horror had rooted itself in the woods. That night I barely slept, haunted by visions of shadowy figures slipping between trees, of cold hands reaching out from the darkness. When dawn came, grey and lifeless, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't run, and I couldn't hide. If I wanted to end this, I had to confront it, go back to where it all started. The hollow. Henley's sister insisted on coming with me. She said she knew the way, though every step closer seemed to drain her strength. We packed what little we could: flashlights, a few weapons that felt pitifully inadequate, and Murphy, who refused to leave my side despite the danger. The woods felt different as we entered them, more oppressive. The trees loomed closer, their gnarled branches reaching like skeletal fingers. We walked in silence, the air growing colder with every step. I could feel the weight of unseen eyes, the prickle of something ancient and malevolent watching from the shadows. The ground beneath us grew soft, almost spongy, and a sickly sweet smell wafted up from the earth. The hollow was close. I could feel it, a pit of darkness buried deep within the woods. Here, Henley's sister whispered, stopping abruptly. "This is where they took him." The ground dipped ahead, a shallow depression ringed by ancient trees. The air felt wrong, thick, oppressive, charged with a dark energy that made my skin crawl. Shadows danced at the edges of the clearing, flickering like flames. I stepped forward, the knife in my hand feeling absurdly small. Murphy growled, the fur along his spine standing on end. A low, rumbling laugh echoed through the trees and the shadows moved, converging. Faces took shape, twisted, hollow-eyed things that wore human features like masks. They surrounded us, closing in. Henley's sister grabbed my arm, her grip cold as ice. "They're bound to this place," she said. "But they can be broken." "How?" I demanded, my eyes never leaving the shifting figures. "Offer what they seek," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Or deny them until they starve." I didn't understand, but there was no time to ask. The shadows surged forward, and I realized that this was it, the final moment. The hollow was awake, and it would not let me go without a fight. The hollow's shadows surged toward us, moving like an ink-stained wave, their forms flickering between human and monstrous shapes. Murphy barked wildly, a desperate sound swallowed by the oppressive darkness. I tightened my grip on the knife, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might break through my ribs. I didn't know how to fight something that wasn't flesh and bone, something that could slip through shadows and strike from nowhere. But I had no choice. Back, Henley's sister shouted, pulling me with surprising strength. "Stay together. They'll separate us if they can." The shadows circled, their movements methodical, patient. I could hear their whispers again, a grating chorus that seemed to vibrate inside my skull. They spoke in fragments, promises and threats, memories twisted into cruel mockery. I saw flashes of Mr. Henley's face, pale and empty-eyed, and I knew they were toying with me, breaking down my resolve piece by piece. Then one of them lunged, a dark blur with glistening eyes. I swung the knife wildly, expecting it to pass through without resistance. But to my shock, it met something solid, and a shriek tore through the air, high-pitched and inhuman. The shadow recoiled, splintering into fragments that melted back into the darkness. "They can be hurt," I gasped, adrenaline surging. "Only when they take form," Henley's sister said, her voice ragged. "But they'll come back." I didn't have time to process that. More shapes lunged, moving with an eerie, predatory grace. I fought them off as best I could, the knife slashing through shadows that solidified only at the last moment. Beside me, Henley's sister wielded a heavy branch like a club, her eyes wild. Murphy snapped and barked, his teeth finding purchase in something that howled and pulled away. We retreated, step by painful step, until our backs were pressed against the gnarled trunk of an ancient tree. The shadows circled, regrouping. This wasn't a fight, it was a feeding ground. They were wearing us down, and I could feel their hunger, their relentless need to consume. The air grew colder, and my breath fogged in front of me. My limbs felt heavy, the knife slipping in my sweaty grip. "This won't end," I whispered, despair clawing at me. "We can't fight them forever." Henley's sister's eyes met mine, and I saw the terrible weight of years spent haunted by this place. "We can end it," she said, "but it requires a sacrifice." Her words sank in, cold and heavy. I remembered what she had said earlier: offer what they seek, or deny them until they starve. The shadows were waiting for something. They were bound to this place, but not without purpose. I didn't know if I could trust her, but I was out of options. "What do they want?" "Souls," she said, barely audible. "Flesh. Life itself. But if denied, they wither. They need more and more, always hungry." The shadows moved again, sensing our hesitation. One of them lunged for Murphy, who yelped and stumbled back, his paw caught in a writhing mass. I acted on instinct, slashing down with the knife, severing the connection. The shadow shrieked and retreated, but the others pressed closer. I understood then. They weren't invincible. They were parasites, ancient, powerful, but vulnerable when exposed. If I couldn't offer them what they sought, I had to find a way to make them starve. But that meant more than fighting them here. It meant denying their reach beyond the hollow. "We have to seal this place," I said, the words barely making sense even as they left my mouth. "Cut them off." Henley's sister nodded, her face pale but resolute. "There is a way." My brother tried, but he failed. "Then we won't." Together, we fought our way toward the heart of the hollow, a jagged, blackened stone that pulsed with a sickly light. The shadows grew more frantic, sensing our intent. They clawed at us, tearing at clothes and flesh. Murphy limped beside me, his determination as fierce as ever. The air burned cold, and the whispers became deafening, promising pain, death, oblivion. Henley's sister collapsed as we reached the stone, her strength finally giving out. I dropped to my knees beside her, the knife shaking in my grip. "What do I do?" I shouted over the cacophony. "Blood binds them," she rasped, her eyes wide and unseeing. "But blood can also break." I understood. My hand trembled as I pressed the blade to my palm, drawing a thin line of blood. The shadows recoiled, hissing, their forms flickering in and out of existence. I placed my bleeding hand against the stone, feeling its unnatural heat, its hunger. It pulsed, fighting back, but I pushed harder, pouring every ounce of will into the act. "Leave," I whispered, the words gaining strength. "You are bound no more." The stone cracked, a jagged line spreading across its surface. The shadows howled, their forms unraveling, dissolving into the air. The ground beneath us trembled, the trees groaning as if in agony. The hollow was breaking apart. I thought I'd be consumed with it, that this would be my end. But as the last shadow faded, the oppressive weight lifted. The air felt clean, the light filtering through the trees warmer, real. I collapsed beside Henley's sister, my vision swimming. Murphy licked my face, his whine the only sound in the sudden stillness. The hollow was gone, or at least, its hold on this world was broken. But as I lay there, gasping for breath, I knew that whatever had dwelled there was ancient and clever. It would wait. It would find new cracks to slip through, new lives to haunt. For now, though, we'd denied it, and that was enough. When I finally stood, the sun was setting, casting long shadows that no longer moved on their own. The woods were just woods again, haunted, perhaps, but quiet. I helped Henley's sister to her feet, both of us battered but alive. The hollow had taken too much already. It wouldn't take anything more. Not today. Though the oppressive grip of the hollow had lifted, I knew it wasn't truly gone. The air felt lighter, and the shadows no longer whispered, but the scars it had left on this place and on us would not fade so easily. Henley's sister leaned on me as we made our way out of the woods, our steps unsteady but determined. Murphy limped alongside, his every movement a reminder of the price we'd paid. The walk back to the edge of the neighborhood felt longer than it should have. The woods stretched endlessly, as if reluctant to release us. I tried to focus on the sound of leaves crunching underfoot, the ordinary rustle of the wind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the hollow was watching, waiting for its moment to claw back into this world. Every snap of a twig made me flinch. Finally, we emerged from the trees. The sight of houses, streetlights, and asphalt streets felt almost unreal. I helped Henley's sister to my porch, where she collapsed onto the steps, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I could see the exhaustion etched into her face, the lines of grief and fear that had been carved over years. I sat beside her, too drained to speak. Murphy pressed himself against my leg, as if afraid I might disappear. "They'll try again," she said after a long silence, her voice flat. "Not now, but someday." I nodded. "How do you know?" "Because they always do." Her eyes met mine, haunted but resolute. "You stopped them this time. But they're patient. They've been here longer than we can understand." "What about you?" I asked. "You've been fighting this alone for years." She looked away, her expression unreadable. "I've done what I could. But it cost me everything. My brother, he was their warning." The memory of Mr. Henley's hollow, glassy-eyed stare flashed through my mind. Whatever the hollow had done to him, it had been a fate worse than death. I swallowed hard, the taste of bile rising in my throat. "Is there a way to end it for good?" She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "If there is, I don't know it. But you can keep it at bay. You know more now. You've touched it and lived." The weight of what she was saying settled over me like a heavy blanket. This fight wasn't over. It might never be. But for the moment, the hollow had been weakened, its power broken. I'd given it blood my own to break its hold. And I'd do it again, if I had to. I'd fight it back, even if it meant living with the darkness always lurking just out of sight. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky bathed in the dying light of day, Henley's sister stood, swaying slightly. "Be careful," she said, her voice low. "They'll remember you." With that, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the neighborhood. I wanted to stop her, to ask what she meant, to plead for more answers. But I couldn't find the words. I watched until she was gone, the silence of the street pressing in. I turned and went inside, locking the door behind me. Murphy settled at my feet, his eyes never leaving the window. I flipped off the lights and let the darkness surround us, listening for anything out of place. The house creaked, the wind whispered through the trees. It was almost peaceful, but I knew better. In the weeks that followed, life settled back into a semblance of normalcy. Neighbors waved as they walked their dogs, children played in the yards, and the woods became just another backdrop to suburban life. But I knew what lay beneath. I'd seen it, felt it, fought it. I checked the locks every night. I listened to every creak and groan of the house. I walked the edge of the woods, searching for signs that the hollow was stirring again. One morning, a package arrived on my doorstep. No return address, just a plain brown box. Inside, I found a note, scrawled in shaky handwriting. "You're not alone." Beneath it lay an old journal, its leather cover worn and cracked. I flipped through the pages, my hands trembling. It was filled with entries from people who had faced the hollow before me, descriptions of shadows, disappearances, warnings, and desperate plans to fight back. Some entries ended abruptly, others faded into incoherent ramblings. but they all shared one thing: a determination to resist. I kept the journal close, reading it late into the night. The stories it told were terrifying, but they were also a reminder that the hollow could be fought. I wasn't alone. There had been others before me, and there would be others after. The battle wasn't over, but it wasn't hopeless. One night, as I sat by the window, journal in hand, I felt a chill pass through the room. Murphy whined softly, his ears pricking up. I looked out into the yard, half expecting to see shadows moving, but there was nothing. Just the wind and the trees. I knew it wouldn't stay that way forever. The hollow would return. It always did. But this time I'd be ready. The hollow was quiet for now, but I could feel its presence lingering like a splinter beneath the skin, a constant reminder that it wasn't truly gone. The journal became my guide, a lifeline in the darkness. I devoured every word, searching for patterns, clues, anything that might help me understand what I was facing. Each entry was a window into another person's nightmare, their battles etched in ink that had faded with time but never lost its weight. Some entries described rituals meant to weaken the hollow's hold: circles of salt, protective markings, chants whispered under the light of the moon. Others spoke of symbols carved into trees or buried beneath the roots, desperate measures to keep the shadows at bay. But more often than not, the entries ended abruptly, sometimes mid-sentence, as if the writer had been interrupted by something they couldn't escape. One night, as I read through a particularly chilling account of a man who claimed to have trapped part of the hollow's essence in a silver locket, I heard a knock at the door. It was soft, hesitant, almost polite. I froze, my blood turning to ice. I checked the clock, 3:13 a.m. No one should be knocking at this hour. Murphy lifted his head, his ears flat against his skull. He didn't bark this time, he just stared at the door, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The knocking came again, a little louder. Whoever or whatever was out there, it was patient. I rose slowly, slipping the knife into my pocket. I couldn't afford to ignore it, not anymore. I approached the door, my footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. I reached for the knob but stopped just short, pressing my ear to the wood. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my throat. Silence. I waited, every muscle tensed. Then, a familiar voice, low and rasping, filtered through the door. "You can't keep it shut forever." It was Mr. Henley's voice, or the hollow's attempt at mimicking it. I felt cold all over. "You're not welcome here," I said, forcing steel into my words. "Go back to where you came from." A laugh, wet and gurgling. "You think you stopped it? You fed it." I wanted to deny it, but the words caught in my throat. The hollow had taken my blood, my offering to shatter the stone. I'd given it what it craved, even if I'd done so in an effort to weaken its hold. It wasn't gone. It had only changed, twisted by what I'd done. The doorknob rattled, and I stumbled back. Murphy's growl grew louder. The journal lay open on the table, its yellowed pages fluttering, as if caught in a sudden breeze. One passage stood out, written in bold, frantic letters: "The hollow is never sated. It adapts. It twists its prison." The knocking stopped, replaced by a different sound, a scraping, dragging noise, like fingernails clawing at the wood. The air in the room felt colder, pressing down on me. Shadows pooled at the edges of my vision, flickering and shifting. I turned back to the journal, searching for anything I might have missed. The silver locket. The man who had trapped part of the hollow's essence had written of its reaction, how it recoiled, how it seemed weaker in its presence. I needed something like that, something to hold it back, even if just for a moment. I grabbed the journal and flipped through, looking for symbols, anything that might help. The air thickened, and the room darkened as if the shadows themselves were swallowing the light. The thing outside was no longer knocking, it was inside, pressing against the edges of reality, testing its limits. Murphy whimpered, and I dropped to my knees, drawing a crude protective circle around us with salt from the kitchen. I didn't know if it would work, but it was all I had. The shadows writhed, forming tendrils that reached for me, for Murphy, for the light that still held them back. They whispered of hunger, of endless dark. I chanted the words I'd found scrawled in the margins of the journal, a desperate incantation whose meaning I didn't fully understand. The tendrils recoiled, writhing in pain, but they didn't vanish. They pressed closer, relentless. Then, with a suddenness that stole my breath, they stopped. The darkness receded, leaving only the faint scent of rot and the oppressive sense of being watched. I stayed in the circle, trembling, until the first light of dawn crept through the window. This time the hollow hadn't taken me, but it had made itself clear it wasn't done. It would never be done. I was part of it now, bound to its game. But I wasn't helpless. I had knowledge, a weapon forged from the stories of those who had come before me. I would fight, even if it meant living on the edge of darkness, always watching, always waiting for the hollow's next move. It was a fight I couldn't walk away from, and the hollow knew that too. The hollow's reach had receded, but its mark on me remained, a festering wound that wouldn't heal. I could feel it like a shadow clinging to my soul, waiting for an opportunity to worm its way back in. The dawn brought no sense of peace, it only cast light on how far I'd been pulled into this nightmare. In the days that followed, I prepared. I gathered supplies, more salt, protective charms from old folklore, silver objects that the journal suggested could disrupt the hollow's hold. I visited Henley's sister again, hoping she might have more insight, but when I arrived, her house was dark, her door ajar. I stepped inside, calling her name. The air smelled of decay. In the living room, I found a pile of ash, a single lock of hair resting atop it. I staggered back, bile rising in my throat. She was gone. No taken. Her final warning echoed in my mind, "They'll remember you." I ran. The hollow was sending a message, and I was next. Back in my house, I bolted the doors and windows, creating makeshift barriers against the dark. But I knew none of it would matter if the hollow wanted to take me. Murphy sensed it too. He stayed close, his eyes constantly scanning for movements I couldn't see. The journal became my obsession. I pored over every page, desperate for anything that might turn the tide. That's when I found a section one overlooked before, hidden beneath a loose flap of leather. The writer spoke of a final ritual, a binding that could permanently weaken the hollow's grip. It required confronting it in its true form, within the heart of its influence. I knew what that meant. I had to return to the hollow's core. Night fell, and the air grew heavy. I didn't wait for the knocking or whispers to begin again. I gathered my supplies, salt, silver, the knife, the journal, and set off for the woods, Murphy at my side. Each step felt like walking into a grave. The trees closed in around us, the darkness thick and oppressive. The air grew colder the closer we came to the hollow's heart, the ground soft and damp beneath our feet. The clearing was, as I remembered it, a jagged circle of ancient trees, their branches clawing at the sky. The stone I had cracked still lay at the center, but its pulse was weaker now, flickering like a dying ember. Shadows danced at the edges of the clearing, but they didn't surge forward. They were waiting. I knelt by the stone, laying out the silver and marking a circle around it with salt. "This ends now," I said aloud, though my voice shook. The journal's ritual required blood, my blood, willingly given. It was a risk. If I failed, it would strengthen the hollow. But if I succeeded... I cut my palm, letting the blood drip onto the stone. The air crackled with energy, and the shadows shuddered. They hissed and writhed, their forms flickering. I began the incantation, the words scraping my throat raw. The shadows surged, testing the circle. They couldn't breach it, but I could feel their fury, their hunger. I pushed harder, pouring my will into the ritual. The stone cracked further, a bright light seeping through. The shadows recoiled, screaming. I pressed on, even as pain lanced through my chest. The hollow fought back, sending waves of darkness crashing against the barrier. Images flashed before me, visions of people it had taken, of faces twisted in agony, of Henley's blank stare. It was trying to break me. But I wouldn't stop. I drove the knife into the heart of the stone, the final step of the ritual. There was a blinding flash, a sound like thunder cracking through the earth. The ground trembled, the air split open with a deafening roar. The shadows screamed, their forms unraveling, pulled back into the stone. I felt the weight of their fury, their desperation, but I held on, forcing them back. Then silence. The air was clear. The oppressive weight was gone. I collapsed, gasping for breath. The stone was shattered, reduced to dust. The hollow's hold had been broken, at least for now, but I knew it was never truly gone. It would try again. It always did. But I'd weakened it, and with every fight, I would grow stronger. Murphy nudged me, his eyes weary but watchful. Together we walked out of the clearing, leaving the shattered remains behind. The hollow's power was broken, but its hunger would never die. I would be ready when it returned. For now, at least, the battle was won. But the war was far from over.